the lantern in the pines. The hike had begun like any other, boots crunching over familiar Appalachian trails, the air cool against his skin, carrying the scent of damp earth and pine. He adjusted his camera strap and glanced down at the journal tucked under his arm, noting the subtle rustle of leaves and the distant, haunting call of an owl. The forest stretched around him in quiet rhythm, yet something felt different, more still than it should have been, as if the usual chorus of crickets and wind through branches had muted itself just for him. The cabin came into view, its weathered logs and mossed roof oddly welcoming, yet a flicker of light between the trees caught his eye. It was brief, almost peripheral, but persistent, a single pulse of glow that seemed to hover and retreat with each blink of his eyes. He shook off the sensation, telling himself it was simply a reflection from his headlamp, or the fireflies beginning their nightly dance. Inside, he arranged his gear, setting the camera to charge and opening the journal to a fresh page. Routine motions should have brought calm, but the flicker lingered in the corners of his vision, and the forest, though familiar, had a patience to it that pressed just beyond awareness. He settled onto the wooden floorboards, the smell of aged timber grounding him, yet a subtle tension remained. A whisper of something observing just beyond the tree line, unresolved and unapproachable, waiting quietly as night began to fall. Night deepened around the cabin, wrapping the forest in a thick, almost tactile darkness that pressed against the windows and doors. The first stirrings of unease began as a subtle movement beyond the tree line, a flicker of light, brief at first, as if a candle had been carried by a cautious hand, yet unmistakably deliberate. Each time he shifted his gaze, it seemed to inch closer, though no figure accompanied it, no sound betrayed the presence of another being. The wind through the pines carried a faint murmur, like whispers brushing against the leaves, words he could not quite catch, but that brushed against his consciousness, teasing recognition. At first, he told himself it was the branches rubbing together, a trick of the air, the natural language of the forest translating into imagined speech. But the sensation persisted, growing sharper, more personal, as if the wind itself had learned to imitate thought. Objects inside the cabin, arranged moments earlier with careful precision, betrayed subtle changes. His camera lens had shifted an inch to the left. A notebook lay open where he had left it closed. A pen rolled slightly from the table to the floor, stopping at an angle that seemed deliberate. Nothing bore fingerprints. Nothing appeared tampered with by human hands, and yet the room no longer obeyed the rules he expected it to follow. Shadows from the firelight stretched unnaturally across the floor, elongating in sudden bursts before shrinking back as if the flames themselves were puppeteering them. He paused, listening, sensing the room breathe in tandem with the forest beyond, feeling the weight of eyes he could not see pressing from every direction. His journal, open to the previous day's notes, seemed to vibrate softly, catching glints of the fire as though reacting to the whispering wind, the flickering lantern, the subtle anomalies around him. He attempted to record the light, raising the camera and adjusting the lens, but the viewfinder revealed only the static emptiness of night, the glow vanishing the moment the camera locked focus. Each movement, each careful step within the cabin was shadowed by something beyond comprehension, a presence that neither announced itself fully nor retreated completely, forcing him to acknowledge that the solitude he had sought was no longer his own. The forest seemed to lean in, leaning closer with the rhythm of the flickering lantern, the whispers threading through his mind, probing memories he hadn't spoken aloud. The longer he remained, the heavier the cabin felt, the walls shrinking in subtle, almost imperceptible ways, narrowing his space, tightening the perimeter around him. Fear was no longer immediate or sharp, but a slow, creeping weight, pressing into the marrow of his bones, merging with the thrill of discovery he had come for, twisting curiosity into suspicion. By the time he finally lowered the camera, heart hammering and breath caught in his chest, he understood that the night had changed, that he was no longer merely observing the forest but participating in it, caught in a quiet, deliberate game with a light that moved closer each time he dared to look. The flicker lingered at the edge of vision, stubborn and patient, marking the night as his alone yet impossibly shared. And he realized the first hour of darkness had already begun to rewrite the rules of reality. The whispers began as the wind shifted, brushing through the pines in patterns that felt deliberate, almost conversational. At first, he thought it was imagination, the natural susurration of the forest twisting into shapes that mirrored his own thoughts. But soon, the words became unmistakable, forming fragments of sentences he'd only just considered in the quiet of his mind. Names he had spoken aloud hours ago, memories he had thought private, all threaded through the murmurs in ways that made his stomach tighten. He rose from the cabin floor, journal in hand, and stepped toward the window, searching the dense blackness between the trunks. The lantern, still faintly flickering beyond the tree line, remained unmoving, yet the forest around it seemed alive, shifting subtly with each glance he stole. The ground under the trees bore no signs of movement, no footprints, nothing to suggest that anyone or anything was out there. And yet he felt watched from multiple angles, as if unseen eyes had positioned themselves just beyond perception. His own heartbeat thudded in time with the whispers, a strange rhythm that made seconds feel stretched and elongated. Glimmers of firelight from the hearth danced across the pages of his journal, revealing lines he hadn't written. Words curling into the margins, responding to the murmuring pines with a precision that felt impossible. He reached to close it, but the pages seemed to resist, curling just out of reach as if the forest itself had a hand in guiding the narrative. Shadows cast by the fireplace leaned outward unnaturally, flicking across walls and floor in ways that defied logic, detaching from their sources, creating forms that hinted at human silhouettes, though none stood in the cabin. He tried to record the sounds on his audio device, raising the microphone toward the window, yet it captured only low, static hiss, the whispers receding into the nothingness beyond. The air grew heavier with each inhale, thick with the scent of pine resin and something more metallic, like the tang of blood, faint and fleeting, never fully realized. Every step he took inside the cabin seemed mirrored by some unseen presence, the floorboards creaking in a pattern he could not place, each groan of the wood matching the tempo of the murmurs outside. Time became disorienting. Seconds stretched into minutes, the boundaries between thought and sound dissolving until he could no longer tell whether the sentences forming in his head were his own, or suggested by the voices in the wind. He sank back onto the cabin floor, gripping the journal, feeling a creeping sensation that the forest itself was alive, not with animals or insects, but with intent. A consciousness that bent perception, weaving threads of memory and anticipation into a tapestry that included him without consent. The lantern beyond the tree line remained there, a patient observer, its flicker unwavering, its light marking the rhythm of the night. The whispers wound tighter, threading through the trees, through the cabin walls, through the very air around him, pulling him into an awareness that he was no longer merely an intruder in this wilderness, but a participant in something vast, deliberate, and unknowable. And as he listened, straining to discern meaning in the murmurs, he realized the forest had learned his thoughts, had catalogued them, and now, in the quiet intervals between each flicker of light and each exhale of wind, it was speaking back. He had tried to convince himself that the forest's whispers were the only anomaly, that the flickering lantern beyond the trees was nothing more than a trick of shadows and imagination. But the cabin, once a sanctuary from the dark woods, began to betray him in ways far subtler and far more unnerving. A camera lens, resting on the table where he had placed it only moments before, had shifted a few inches, its glass catching the firelight at an impossible angle. His journal, which he had set open to record observations, fluttered as if stirred by an invisible hand, the pages curling and twisting despite the still air. Every item he looked at seemed to live a small, secret life, rearranging itself when he dared not watch. Shadows elongated unnaturally across the floor, stretching from the hearth and curling toward corners of the cabin as if reaching for something unseen. He tried to record the lantern outside, lifting the camera toward the window, but the viewfinder returned only black, static frames that captured none of the movement he could feel with every nerve in his body. Each flicker of the fire seemed to draw the shadows closer, teasing shapes that suggested humanoid forms, limbs bending in ways that should have been impossible, disappearing whenever he blinked or turned to confront them. He stepped carefully across the floorboards, hearing creaks that did not match his steps, as if someone, or something, walked in perfect silence beside him, pacing in tandem. The smell of damp pine filled the cabin, mingling with a metallic tang that made the back of his throat dry. The whispers persisted outside, now interwoven with the irregular creaks and sighs of the cabin, forming a pattern he could not decipher but instinctively feared. He reached for a notebook he had left on the shelf, only to find it tilted at an angle so precise it seemed deliberate. The pages no longer blank but etched with markings that resembled symbols he could almost recognize, almost understand, but could not interpret. The air felt heavier, pressing against his chest as if the cabin itself was breathing, alive, observing, testing him. Every glance toward the doorway, toward the shadows that clung to the walls, left him feeling smaller, less certain of the rules that governed the world he had known. Attempts to capture or prove what he was seeing failed repeatedly. Cameras recorded only darkness, audio captured only static, and even the lantern beyond the tree line appeared indifferent, holding its position as though mocking his confusion. He began to notice a pattern in the chaos. The items, the shadows, the whispers, all seemed to respond to his attention, retreating when observed, advancing when distracted, shaping the environment into something unfamiliar yet intimately aware of him. A creeping thought took hold, that this place, these woods, the cabin itself, were no longer bound by ordinary rules, that logic and expectation had been suspended, and he was caught within an awareness that was not entirely human. Every sound, every flicker, every movement carried intention. Every object shifting when he wasn't looking was a reminder. He was being watched, studied, catalogued, and perhaps prepared for something that would unfold before the night's end. The realization settled in, heavy and unyielding. The cabin had become a vessel for forces beyond comprehension, and he was no longer the one controlling his surroundings. The first movement caught him off guard, a flicker at the cabin doorway that shouldn't have been possible. The lantern, once distant and unmoving among the trees, now hovered at the threshold, its glow spilling in irregular patterns across the floorboards, twisting the familiar cabin into something alien. No figure accompanied the light, no shape to explain its presence. Yet the shadows it cast seemed deliberate, arranging themselves into shapes that followed his every motion. The whispers, which had once skirted the edges of his awareness, intensified, repeating details he had not spoken aloud, passages from his journal, fragments of thoughts he hadn't dared write. The minutiae of his observations whispered back to him in a voice that was neither wholly human nor entirely distant. Panic edged through him as he stepped back, the wooden floor cold beneath his boots, every creak sounding like deliberate footfalls that mirrored his own. He realized the light wasn't static. It seemed to pursue him inch by inch, as if measuring his reactions, feeding on his hesitation. He reached instinctively for his journal, hoping to capture proof, but the pages resisted the firelight, their words blurring and shifting, some forming sentences he had never written, speaking of places he hadn't yet seen and events he hadn't yet endured. The shadows began to detach fully from the objects that cast them, slithering along the walls, coiling and stretching with unnatural agility, circling in a rhythm that was almost mesmerizing, almost hypnotic. He could feel the air thicken, the scent of damp earth mingling with a faint metallic tang, and his pulse thrummed in time with the flickering glow. Every instinct screamed to retreat, to flee back into the depths of the cabin, but the doorway and the lantern seemed to extend impossibly farther than physics would allow, a corridor of light that had no end, no beginning. The whispers now converged into almost coherent phrases, uttering his name and recounting his earliest thoughts from the day, blending memory and foresight into a single, unnerving narration. He stumbled backward, tripping over his own gear, heart hammering as the lantern's glow stretched to touch every corner, yet revealed nothing tangible beyond its ominous presence. Every object he glanced at seemed to warp in response, the camera tilting slightly, the notebook shifting closer to the door, as though drawn by the lantern's invisible pull. He realized, with a sinking certainty, that the forest outside had ceased to matter. It was not the trees that watched, nor the wind, nor the distant hoot of owls, but something anchored to the cabin itself, focused entirely on him, cataloging his reactions, reading his fears in ways he could not fully comprehend. As he backed away toward the hearth, the lantern lingered, unwavering, a silent sentinel that refused explanation. Even as he crouched in the corner, eyes fixed on the doorway, he felt the light press closer, the whispers curl around him, and a chilling thought took root. It would not leave, not until he had answered questions he did not yet know. And somewhere deep in the echoing silence of the forest, he sensed that the night had only begun. The forest pressed against the cabin as though leaning in to watch, the darkness beyond the window thick and suffocating. Footsteps whispered through the underbrush, crisp snaps of twigs that should have betrayed a human presence, yet when he dared to peer into the night, the woods remained impossibly empty. Shadows moved along the cabin walls independently, stretching and contracting, forming vague humanoid silhouettes that dissolved whenever he tried to confront them, leaving only a sense of deliberate observation. Each time he turned his head, a shadow would shift, appearing just at the edge of his vision, teasing, following, refusing to be named or touched. Objects inside the cabin no longer obeyed gravity or reason. Notebooks slid across the floor on their own, camera lenses rolled from tables, and scraps of paper assembled into cryptic patterns, some resembling figures from his own memories, others shapes he could not place, symbols that hummed with a quiet, almost tangible energy. The whispers had grown louder, repeating his thoughts before he could form them, trailing off into half-finished sentences that chilled him more than any clear phrase ever could. He tried to write in his journal, desperate to anchor himself in the reality he once understood, but the pen moved as if guided by an invisible hand, scripting words he had not conceived, detailing actions he had not yet taken, predictions of events that felt imminent and inescapable. The fire flickered against the walls, shadows leaping in ways that defied physics, and for a moment he could swear he saw a figure emerge fully formed from the darkness, only to have it collapse back into the wall like smoke drawn down a drain. Every sense screamed that the cabin had become an entity of its own, alive, aware, cataloging his reactions, and molding the environment around him with patient, unhurried precision. The floorboards creaked beneath him, yet no one else had entered. The air grew heavier with each breath, carrying whispers that now threaded together in a language he almost understood, fragmented instructions or warnings that dissolved if he concentrated too long. He realized he could not close his eyes, for in the darkness behind his lids, shapes danced with grotesque familiarity, shadows performing acts he had only glimpsed in dreams or half-remembered fears. Time began to fray. Minutes lengthened, then collapsed, the forest outside alternately silent and cacophonous, the wind carrying voices that might have been owls, might have been human, might have been neither. His body trembled, caught between fight and flight, each instinct screaming that he should flee, yet his feet felt glued to the cabin floor, as if the house itself would not let him go until it had finished its invisible work. The whispers now repeated the exact words he had intended to write in his journal, sentence for sentence, predicting his next thoughts, his next movements, an intimate invasion of mind and memory that made him question the solidity of self. He crouched low, heart hammering, staring at the walls that should have been familiar, now alive with intent, realizing that the night had escalated beyond recognition, and that the forest, the cabin, and the shadows were no longer separate from him. They were extensions of a consciousness he could not name, a presence that had been waiting for him, cataloging him, and was far from finished. And in that moment, every whisper, every shifting shadow, every rearranged object coalesced into a single, undeniable certainty. Whatever haunted the night had claimed the cabin, and him, in ways he was only beginning to comprehend. Blood on the ridge. The first light of morning broke over the Appalachian ridge, soft and golden, painting the rocks in gentle shades of amber and rose. She hoisted her camera, eager to capture the quiet beauty, the way the mist curled in the hollows, the way the ridge seemed to stretch endlessly into the sky. The air smelled of damp earth and pine, crisp against her skin, and for a moment nothing seemed out of place. Her footsteps crunched softly on the trail, each one echoing against the distant slopes, and then she saw it. Red stains smeared across the rocks, subtle at first, almost like rust or lichen, glinting faintly in the morning sun. She crouched, brushing a finger over a patch, expecting powdery residue, something natural, but the warmth under her touch made her pause. The streaks weren't dry. They hadn't been here yesterday. Shaking off the unease, she moved further along the trail, framing shots with her camera, the stains following her path like a slow, deliberate breadcrumb. With every step, the red seemed darker, fresher, almost wet, and a strange pattern formed as her eyes traced them upward toward the ridges she hadn't yet reached. Then a rustle came from below the slope, a subtle crack of branches against stone. She froze, breath catching in her chest. The sound was faint, distant, yet deliberate, as if the forest itself had exhaled. She told herself it was just a deer, maybe the wind, but a chill ran down her spine. The ridge that had seemed so serene was no longer entirely empty. Something, or someone, was watching. Each step along the ridge seemed to draw the stains closer, as if they had been waiting for her arrival. The red streaks clung to the stones and roots, unnaturally vivid against the pale morning light, almost glowing where the sun hit them at a low angle. At first, she tried to rationalize them. Rust, mineral deposits, traces of lichen, but as she moved forward, the stains grew fresher, the color deeper, almost wet, and the edges sharper, smeared as though something had dragged along the rock face. Her boots crunched over the trail, yet the trail itself seemed unchanged, as if it hadn't been disturbed at all, and she realized with a small, prickling dread that the path behind her looked exactly as it had when she first arrived. The marks didn't recede, they followed. A breeze stirred through the pines below the ridge, carrying a whisper so faint that she almost dismissed it at first. Her name. Just a syllable, elongated and soft, drifting from the shadows of the valley floor, curling upward with the mist that clung stubbornly to the slopes. She froze, ears straining, heart skipping in sudden bursts, scanning the tree line and jagged stones for movement. Nothing. Not a deer, not a bird, not a human shape. Only the trail, winding endlessly upward, and the stubborn red marks that had begun to form a trail of their own across rocks she swore she had already passed Dot. Her breathing grew shallow, each exhale loud in the crisp air, and the whispers came again, clearer now, taunting her attention. A voice, or maybe a dozen voices layered together, calling her name, calling it over and over, echoing in impossible directions, slipping between the wind and the rocks and her own mind. The sound seemed to emanate from nowhere and everywhere at once, drawing her gaze downward toward the valley, yet demanding she look forward, upward, along the ridge that stretched into an indistinct horizon. She crouched by a particularly vivid smear of red, studying it, trying to make sense of it. The surface was smooth, cold, yet sticky under her fingertips. She felt a tremor in her hand, a tiny shock of revulsion as she traced its shape, following the smear as it curved around a tree root and disappeared behind a boulder. The trail was deliberate, intentional, as though guiding her somewhere she didn't want to go. Her camera hung at her side, heavy, almost alive, as though vibrating with its own awareness of the scene. She raised it, framing a shot of the marks, and then lowered it quickly. The viewfinder had caught movement, a flicker of shadow across the opposite peak, mimicking her stance, her tilt, even the turn of her head. She blinked, and it vanished, leaving only the still rocks, the stubborn stains, and the impossibly quiet forest. Her footsteps quickened, hesitant at first, then more determined, following the trail while trying to ignore the whispers. Yet, no matter how fast she moved, the sounds followed, rising and falling in pitch, blending with the rustle of leaves, the tap of distant branches, until it became impossible to distinguish wind from voice or shadow from solid shape. The red stains continued to smear across every surface she passed, flat ledges, jagged stones, exposed roots. Each new streak was sharper, darker, almost pulsing under her gaze, a rhythm that seemed to match the quiet thump of her heart. She reached a bend where the ridge leveled briefly, a spot that should have offered a clear view of the valley below, but the mist clung so thickly that it swallowed everything. From somewhere deep within that gray haze, the whispering grew urgent enough to make her stop completely. She called back, testing the empty air, her voice shaking, only to hear a strange harmony of her own words returned at an impossible delay, distorted and layered, repeating, layering, mocking her attempt to locate the source. The path behind her remained empty, pristine, yet the red stains continued, now smearing across stones she hadn't yet reached, anticipating her steps, following her, marking her dot. She paused at the next incline, a rising sense of vertigo crawling over her skin. The ridge had stretched farther than it should, far enough that her map and compass offered no reassurance. The sun climbed higher, but the light did not seem to penetrate the mist fully. Shadows clung unnaturally to rocks, corners of boulders that shouldn't have any depth now warped and twisted in her peripheral vision. Each breath tasted metallic, her throat dry, yet the sound of whispering persisted, more distinct, as if multiple voices were pressing from the valley below, insisting she continue along the ridge she could no longer trust. Even as she pressed on, she felt it, an awareness in the forest, a presence lingering just beyond sight. The red stains led, and she followed, the whispers calling her name, and all around the ridge seemed to hold its breath, remembering each step, each pause, each trembling footfall, as though the trail itself waited for her to move deeper into its hold. The whispers had grown louder by the time she reached the midpoint of the ridge, threading through the trees and bouncing off jagged rocks, repeating her name over and over. Each repetition carried a cadence that matched her heartbeat, echoing from angles that made the valley below feel impossibly vast, yet suffocatingly close. She scanned the neighboring peaks and noticed movement. A shadowy figure perched along a crag, mirroring her stance as she raised her camera, crouched, or stepped over roots. When she blinked, it vanished, leaving only the uneven stone and the curling mist, as though the ridge itself had swallowed it, whole dot. The trail twisted unnaturally beneath her boots. What should have been a short incline stretched longer than she remembered, and every turn seemed to bring the ridge closer to the sky while pushing the valley farther down. The red stains followed relentlessly, now smeared across narrow ledges, dark and glistening, as if they had been freshly applied moments before. She could not tell if the marks were real or imagined. The forest held its breath. The wind carried no scent, yet every sound, the faint crackle of leaves underfoot, the soft brush of distant branches, felt amplified, intimate, deliberate. Voices called again, this time more insistent, layered over themselves. A whisper would start in the tree line behind her, echo in the mist below, then fade into a low hum that seemed to come from inside her own skull. She froze, trying to pinpoint the source. The hairs on her neck rising as the figure appeared again, now on the opposite peak, hands lifting as if to mirror her tentative movements. The shadow's presence was precise, deliberate, anticipatory. It did not run when she moved closer. It did not flinch. It existed solely to mimic, to observe, and to vanish the instant she sought proof. The ridge itself felt wrong. Rocks that had seemed stable shifted subtly under her weight. Edges of ledges she had passed moments before now slightly misaligned, as though the earth had rearranged itself in her absence. Every step became a negotiation with unseen forces. The path ahead appeared simultaneously familiar and impossible. Her camera swung at her side, and when she glanced down at the viewfinder, her stomach twisted. Mist curled across the frame, catching shapes that moved independent of the wind. Shadows twisted where none should have existed, forming silhouettes that seemed to lean toward her, watching Dot. The red stains thickened, forming patterns along the rocks, almost directional, guiding her forward. The trail was no longer a path, but a language she could not read, smeared in color she could not rationalize, echoing a presence she could not name. And always the whispers, repeating her name, sometimes soft and intimate, sometimes loud enough to make her ears ring. The figure appeared one final time, perched at a distance where she could see it clearly enough to notice the impossible symmetry. Every movement she made, every turn of her head mirrored perfectly. Then, as her eyes closed for a fraction of a second, it was gone, leaving a lingering weight on the ridge, a silence so heavy it pressed against her chest. She pressed on, though her pace was uncertain, as the ridge stretched further into the clouds, the valley below lost in mist. Each step seemed preordained, the trail leading her not toward safety, but deeper into the surveillance of the shadowed peaks. The air thickened, the whispers layered into a dissonant chorus, and the red stains became impossible to ignore, smeared across every rock she passed. She realized, with creeping terror, that the ridge did not merely exist around her. It existed for her, and every movement she made was recorded, observed, echoed in shapes and sounds she could neither predict nor escape. She forced herself to move faster along the ridge, the rhythm of her boots crunching over gravel barely masking the thrum of unease building in her chest. The red stains streaked across the flat ledges now, darker and glossier, forming lines that drew her forward like a trail she could not resist. Rocks shifted underfoot, subtle but undeniable, tilting just slightly when she stepped, as if the ridge itself was rearranging beneath her. No wind stirred the air, no animal ventured near, yet every step carried the sense that she was being guided or watched. At the corner of her eye, movement flickered along a distant peak, a shadow that paused whenever she looked directly, then resumed, mimicking her posture in ways both precise and impossible. She stopped, held her breath, and the shadow froze as if aware she had noticed. When she dared to blink, it was gone again, leaving only the mist curling between rocks, hiding the space it had occupied moments before. Her heart beat erratically, a drum she could hear echoing in the emptiness around her, and the whispers she had thought distant now pressed closer, curling along the rocks and over ledges, repeating her name with an eerie patience. The trail felt longer than it had moments ago, each incline steeper, each ledge narrower, the ridge folding subtly upon itself in ways that made her stomach lurch. The red streaks thickened, smeared across surfaces that had previously seemed untouched, guiding her toward a rise she did not remember from the first light. Her camera, slung at her side, captured glimpses of shapes that moved in the periphery of the lens, shadows that did not match anything in front of her. She glanced at it quickly, then looked away, afraid that studying the images would anchor her to the ridge in ways she could not yet understand. Occasional rocks shifted beneath her boots, subtle nudges that made her doubt the stability of the path. Each time she turned, the forest below remained silent, yet the whispering voices persisted, layered and repetitive, curling through the mist and scraping along the edges of her perception. She could feel the presence of the figure again, just beyond her vision, a watcher perched on a peak she could never seem to reach. Every movement she made, the tilt of her head, the adjustment of her pack, the pause to catch her breath, was mirrored, deliberate, unnerving dot. The ridge seemed alive, bending the natural landscape into patterns she could not comprehend. The red stains created an almost navigational system, a map she did not wish to follow yet could not avoid. Her pace faltered as the sense of being observed intensified, the rhythm of her steps now entwined with the echo of another, invisible and impossible, moving perfectly in tandem. A creeping realization settled in. This was no ordinary shadow, no trick of light. The ridge had an awareness, a memory, and it knew her. As she approached the next rise, the shadow appeared one final time, not fleeting, not on the periphery, but in full silhouette against the misty morning glow. For a heartbeat, she froze, unable to move or look away, and then, in the instant she blinked, it vanished entirely, leaving the ridge empty, still, yet impossibly attentive. The red stains continued forward, darker, fresher, as if daring her to continue, to follow, to witness what the ridge would reveal next. She pressed on, each step heavier, each glance over her shoulder laden with the certainty that the watcher could return at any moment, and that the ridge itself would remember everything she had done. By the time she turned back toward the trailhead, her legs were heavy, every muscle humming with exhaustion, but the ridge still seemed to follow her, stretching longer than it had before, bending impossibly with each step. She paused to check her camera, hoping the lens might offer clarity, a rational explanation for the shadows and the whispers, but what she saw made her stomach twist. Images flickered across the screen, frames she had never taken, each more unnerving than the last. Faces pressed against the lens stared back, mouths frozen in silent screams, eyes wide with pleading or accusation. They were impossibly close, their skin pale, expressions twisted, yet none seemed alive. She flipped through the pictures faster, heart hammering, realizing the faces shifted subtly between frames, not like photos of the same moment, but like the ridge itself had captured fragments of something alive, something aware of her presence. One frame revealed a shadow behind her, perfectly mimicking her posture from a moment she could not remember. Another showed the red streaks on the rocks curling into shapes that resembled hands reaching upward, grasping at the sky. Every image escalated the horror. Each shot a piece of a story the ridge had recorded without her knowledge or consent. Her hands shook as she scrolled, finally arriving at the last frame. Her breath caught in her throat. There she was, or rather, what should have been impossible, her own body lying along the ridge, motionless, untouched by time. The sunlight glinted across the rocks, illuminating the image with a surreal clarity that made her question reality. She could feel the ridge's gaze in that instant. Patient, indifferent, as if it had always intended for her to see this. The photographs were not mere recordings. They were warnings, markers of the ridge's memory, proof that it had claimed her in ways she could not yet understand. Her pulse raced, ears straining for the faintest sound, but the whispers had faded into an oppressive silence. Even the usual morning wind seemed absent, the ridge holding its breath, watching. She lowered the camera, unable to look away, feeling a shiver creep along her spine. Each photo remained vivid in her mind, impossible to unsee, etched into her memory as though the ridge had imprinted them there deliberately. She realized then that leaving the trailhead would not erase what she had experienced. The ridge had her recorded in its memory, a story unfolding beyond time and reason. Even as she moved toward the end of the trail, the images lingered, the red stains she had followed seeming to shimmer faintly in her mind's eye. The shadowy figure that had mirrored her steps, the whispers that called her name, the unnatural stretch of the ridge. All of it fused into a singular dread, impossible to shake. The camera's memory card hummed quietly in her bag, almost alive, as if the ridge continued recording even now, waiting for the next hiker who might follow her path. She took a final glance over her shoulder, toward the neighboring peak where the shadow had first appeared, but it was empty. The mist curling lazily over the rocks as if nothing had ever moved there. And yet, deep inside, she knew the ridge would not forget. The photographs had proven it, marking her presence in a way that would last far beyond her steps, far beyond the fleeting hours she had spent on its slopes. The ridge remembered, and now she did too, but with a terror that no sunrise could wash away. She reached the trailhead as the sun climbed higher, the warmth doing little to chase away the chill that had settled deep in her bones. Every step away from the ridge felt heavier, as if the path itself resisted her departure, stretching and folding in ways that made her doubt the hours she had spent on it. The forest was silent now, birds cautious or absent, and the wind carried only the faintest, unnatural rustle, like the ridge itself exhaling. Rocks and ledges that had seemed ordinary in the morning now appeared subtly altered, their edges sharper, shadows lingering longer than they should. Her camera lay in her hands, the memory card humming quietly, almost deliberately, as though alive with its own purpose. She couldn't stop looking at it, compelled to scroll through the images again, even though each glance filled her chest with a tightening dread. Faces she had never seen pressed against the lens, screaming silently or staring with accusing eyes, shadows contorted into shapes she could not identify. She had tried to convince herself it was a trick of light, her exhaustion, or a lapse of perception. But the camera's evidence was undeniable. As she packed her gear into her bag, she noticed footprints near the edge of the clearing. Small, erratic, not her own. They circled the tent and drifted toward the ridge before vanishing into the soil, leaving no trace behind. The pattern echoed the shapes the ridge had carved into the rocks, human forms in miniature. A silent signature that whispered of observation, of something persistent and patient. Even without the whispers or the shadows, she felt watched, the weight of unseen eyes pressing against her, calculating, remembering. The trailhead stretched before her like a promise of safety, but as she lifted her gaze toward the ridge, a movement caught the corner of her eye. For a fleeting second, a shadow mirrored her stance on a distant ledge, paused, then vanished. It was impossible, too far for any human, and yet too deliberate to be her imagination. Her heartbeat spiked, and the hairs on her arms bristled. The ridge was not done with her. It had recorded her presence, claimed it, and stored it in the folds of rock and mist. She began to walk down the access road, each step faster than the last, trying to convince herself the ordeal was over. But the sensation of being marked, catalogued, haunted, clung to her like a second skin. Even when the trees gave way to the broader path, when the parking lot came into view and the sound of distant traffic reached her ears, she could not shake the feeling that the ridge continued to watch, remembered, waited. The memory card in her camera seemed to pulse faintly in her pocket, echoing the ridge's silent, patient vigilance dot. Hours later, when she finally reached her car, the images replayed in her mind with unnerving clarity. She dared not look back, but in her mind's eye the ridge remained, stretching endlessly, its rocks slick with streaks of red she had never seen before, its shadows still moving subtly just beyond her vision. She drove away, yet the knowledge lingered. The ridge held her story, its memory outlasting time, outlasting her own footsteps. Even as the tires carried her further into civilization, she understood that leaving did not equal escape. The ridge remembered, and now so did she, in a way that would follow her silently for the rest of her life. She stood at the edge of the trailhead, the sun now high enough to burn away most of the morning mist, yet the ridge behind her seemed to shimmer with a memory of the night. Every rock, every ledge, held an echo of what had passed, as if the landscape itself had absorbed her presence and stored it somewhere beyond the reach of reason. The wind whispered faintly through the trees, carrying no scent of pine or soil, only the subtle undertone of something patient and watching. She could feel it pressing on her back, heavy and constant, the ridge remembering her in ways she could not yet comprehend. Her camera, clutched tightly in her hands, hummed faintly, as though attuned to the ridge's will. She scrolled through the images once more, each frame more impossible than the last. Faces she had never captured pressed against the lens, frozen in silent screams or pleading stares. The final photo, the one she could not unsee, showed her own body lying along the rocks of the ridge, untouched by time yet impossibly present, staring back at her with eyes wide in silent terror. She dropped the camera, but even as it hit the ground, the memory of the ridge seemed to pulse through her veins. The forest surrounding the trailhead was unnervingly still. No birds, no rustling leaves, only the rhythmic beat of her own heart and the subtle shifting of shadows just beyond vision. Footsteps that weren't her own crunched lightly in the underbrush, circling her position before fading into nothing. The pattern was familiar, eerily deliberate, like the ridge itself had arranged it, a silent demonstration of the control. Her skin prickled, and she dared not look back. Yet the ridge called to her in a language she could feel rather than hear, insistent, patient, and impossibly enduring. She forced herself into the car, starting the engine, the vibration and warmth offering some semblance of reality. Yet, even inside, the ridge remained alive. The camera's memory card pulsed faintly in her pocket, and in the rearview mirror, shadows flickered across the parking area. She told herself it was the morning light, the exhaustion, but reason did little to quiet the persistent dread. Every glance forward along the road seemed to fold back on itself, the ridge's memory stretching invisibly into her present. Bending perception and time dot driving away. The trailhead disappeared behind trees, but the weight of being remembered pressed upon her shoulders. The sensation lingered, a quiet insistence that the ridge had recorded every heartbeat, every misstep, and would continue to do so long after she left its physical bounds. Even as civilization drew near, as distant traffic noises replaced the forest's hush, she could feel the ridge watching, waiting, a silent predator without form or voice. By the time she reached her home, the sun fully risen and the roads crowded with life, the experience refused to fade. Her camera sat on the passenger seat, each image a testament to the ridge's memory, each frame a silent accusation. She understood with a creeping clarity that leaving the ridge had not meant escape. It remembered her as she would remember it, an eternal witness to the impossible, the uncanny, and the unexplainable. The forest's claim was complete, invisible yet undeniable, and she carried it within her, tethered to a place that existed both in the world and beyond it. The Hollow Creek Choir. The trail ended at a clearing beside the creek, quiet except for the water murmuring over smooth stones. They unloaded packs, stacking wood into a neat pile, tossing logs onto the fire pit one by one. The last rays of sun splashed across the trees, long fingers of gold brushing against the damp undergrowth. Laughter bounced between the friends, light and careless, echoing briefly before fading into the hush of evening. Smoke rose in thin tendrils, curling into the chill air, carrying the faint scent of pine and wet earth. It seemed ordinary, the kind of night they had imagined when planning this trip, the kind of night they thought would settle them into the wilderness. Yet, as the first stars blinked awake, something tugged at the edges of perception. A small detail off in the rhythm of the night. Shadows stretched longer than they should have, creeping along the creek bank like slow, deliberate fingers. The sound of water itself felt exaggerated, too loud against the quiet, as if the creek were straining to reach them. The fire flared once, then settled back to a soft glow, throwing dancing shapes across their tents. A faint melody drifted on the breeze, almost imperceptible at first. A single note, maybe two, but it was there, carried in a way that made the night feel impossibly deep. One of them paused, tilting their head, uncertain if the sound was from the wind or from something else entirely. They shrugged and laughed it off, but the unease had already taken root. As darkness thickened, the melody grew, layering into harmonics that didn't exist naturally. It wove between the rustling trees and the creek's constant chatter, a thread of music threading through everything. The friends' voices began to falter, conversation breaking off mid-sentence, their attention drawn repeatedly toward the source, or what they thought was the source, though there was no source to find. It felt alive, moving with them, circling around the clearing, shifting directions when they turned. The shadows of the trees stretched and recoiled like they were breathing, bending subtly toward the creek. A cold wind whispered across the fire, carrying the faint tang of wet stone and something else, metallic and sharp. The friends huddled closer to the flames, noticing that despite the wind, the logs hadn't shifted. No new embers appeared, and yet the firelight flickered in patterns that didn't match the movement of the flames themselves. Every glance toward the darkened forest seemed to reveal a shimmer, a flicker in the corner of their eyes, a suggestion of something just beyond vision. The melody, still faint, threaded through their pulses, barely perceptible but undeniably there. One of them bent down to poke the fire again, and the melody sharpened, rising slightly as though reacting. A branch snapped somewhere far off, yet no one had stepped there, and the sound came precisely between the trees, spatially impossible, circling them in ways the brain couldn't rationalize. The group exchanged glances, uneasy smiles stretching thin across tense faces, knowing without saying that the night had changed in ways they didn't understand. They sat closer together as the darkness deepened, the creek now a murmuring presence rather than a passive backdrop. The faint melody hummed through the air, brushing against ears, slipping through gaps between thoughts, a thread that threaded through the forest itself. The first stars had risen, but the sky felt heavier, the distance between them and the moon unnervingly vast. A sense of being watched began to press at the edges of perception, subtle but insistent, like a shadow pressing from beneath the surface of everything they knew about this night. The fire crackled softly, and in that tiny, fleeting sound it seemed to echo back the faint harmony they hadn't noticed at first, as if the forest itself was responding. The friends shifted uneasily, senses straining, hearts beating faster though they didn't speak. The ordinary night, the one they had expected, the one that should have been calm, was gone. In its place, the first thread of something impossible had begun to weave itself into the clearing, in the creek, and into the minds of everyone sitting too long to notice the quiet things waiting in the shadows. And somewhere just beyond the creek, carried on the wind between the stones and the trees, a note lingered, impossibly precise, impossibly human, almost a whisper. The night was listening, and they had already been heard. The wind shifted, carrying the faint hum farther across the creek, and suddenly it was no longer faint. Harmony layered upon harmony, impossibly precise, rising from somewhere and nowhere all at once. The friends froze mid-motion, eyes scanning the forest and the water, but the trees remained still. The creek shimmered quietly, and there was no one to be found. The music seemed alive, aware, circling them with every hesitant step they took, slipping between branches and creeping along the ground like a living thing. It wrapped itself around the firelight, threading through the smoke in subtle patterns that made the flames flicker in rhythm with the melody. Each note threaded into their ears, pressing faintly against their skulls, as if listening for the very pulse of their thoughts. Laughter that had come so easily earlier now caught in throats and died in uncertain smiles. One friend swore the sound shifted as he stepped toward the water's edge, as though the choir was aware of him, reacting to his movements. Another backed away instinctively, and the harmony followed, circling closer, overlapping in ways that no single source could produce. It felt as though the air itself had become the instrument, bending the wind, the fire, and even the creek into a choir that existed beyond logic. They turned toward one another, their shared panic growing, but every glance seemed mirrored by the music, anticipating fear before it fully formed, heightening unease with uncanny precision. The creek itself began to participate, small ripples rising and falling as if drawn to the cadence of the harmonics. The water's surface shimmered under moonlight, reflecting light that didn't belong to the fire, glimmering in patterns that felt deliberate. One of them stepped forward, curiosity wrestling with dread, and the melody altered immediately, tightening and twisting around them like threads pulling taut. A cold breeze skimmed their necks, carrying a scent faintly metallic, like iron mixed with wet stone, mingling with the earthy aroma of the forest floor. The fire flared suddenly, sending sparks spiraling upward, only for the smoke to curve unnaturally, moving counter to the wind, as if the air itself were observing, bending to the song. Every attempt to pinpoint the source failed. Devices and natural cues seemed to betray them. The compass spun erratically. Phone screens flickered and glitched, shadows stretched in directions that made no sense. The melody shifted with uncanny intelligence, responding to each footstep, each breath, almost teasing them. A hand reached instinctively for a branch, yet as it moved, the harmonics adjusted, dipping into minor keys that gnawed at the edges of rational thought. Their breaths became louder in their own ears, hearts hammering in step with the choir's rhythm. Each inhale and exhale echoed, warped, amplified. Panic, at first subtle, began to gnaw at their awareness, settling behind the eyes, tightening the chest, setting teeth on edge with a sound that seemed both external and internal. Occasionally, one thought they glimpsed movement between trees, flickers of pale shapes vanishing before recognition, but when they turned, the direction shifted, impossible to locate. The harmony responded instantly, rising in tension, subtly mocking, wrapping them in a cocoon of sound that made running pointless. They huddled closer, hands brushing, breaths mingling, trying to ground themselves in the reality they understood, but the night refused to yield. It pressed in, thick with notes that smelled of wet stone and smoke, brushing cold against their skin, twisting through the canopy in serpentine arcs. The firelight warped, dancing in time with the tones, shadows stretching unnaturally along the creek, suggesting forms where no one could exist. Time itself seemed to dilate. Minutes stretched impossibly long. Each second felt like an hour as the choir maintained its impossible alignment with their own racing hearts. Fear became tangible, coiling around them, and with every attempt to flee, the music anticipated, rising, falling, circling, refusing escape. The friends realized that this was no ordinary night, no simple serenade carried on the wind. Something beyond comprehension had chosen them, and with every note, every harmonic twist, it pressed closer. Their laughter, their ease, the ordinary comfort of companionship had evaporated, leaving only the uncanny, impossible melody that surrounded them from every direction. And as the creek surface shimmered in moonlight, reflecting impossible patterns of light and shadow, it was clear that the night itself had begun to move with intent. The choir was everywhere and nowhere, a presence that listened, anticipated, and waited, leaving the friends suspended between fear and fascination, with nothing but the music and the darkness pressing in on all sides. The night thickened around them, and every attempt to find orientation became a torment of impossibility. Compasses spun wildly, needles jerking as though possessed, circling in erratic patterns that no earthly magnet could explain. Phones flickered and glitched, their screens dancing with static before cutting to black, leaving the friends staring into the darkness without even the faint reassurance of light. The melody that had haunted the previous hour now twisted in subtle dissonance, harmonies stretching, bending, and fragmenting in time with their racing hearts. Each pulse, each shallow breath seemed to draw the song tighter around them, threading anxiety and dread into every note. One friend stepped forward, drawn to the creek by some irrational impulse, and the water responded as if it had been waiting. Ripples formed across the surface, small at first, then spreading in patterns that were almost human. Faces, mouths agape, eyes wide, screaming silently in frozen agony. The reflections rippled and shifted unnaturally, yet remained unnervingly clear, like a cruel echo of the world above the water, mirroring what should not exist. Panic rose, but even as fear burned through them, a perverse curiosity pressed forward. Their instincts screamed to flee, to run back toward the tents, toward safety, yet every step seemed measured, anticipated. The choir's cadence warped subtly, taunting, twisting with a precision that suggested intelligence. It pulsed with them, threading through the shadows of the trees, curling along the edge of the firelight, stretching into the darkness like invisible fingers probing for weakness. Branches cracked underfoot, leaves whispered in the wind, and yet nothing moved in ways that made sense. Every shadow seemed to bend toward them, Every reflection in the water and fire stretched and flickered in impossible directions. One friend froze, certain they saw a figure leaning from behind a tree, yet when all eyes turned, the space held nothing but empty darkness. And still the melody responded, rising, falling, circling, harmonizing with their collective heartbeat. The forest itself seemed aware. Sounds that had been natural, rustling leaves, distant nocturnal calls, shifted in rhythm to the song, a subtle distortion that made each familiar noise alien, threatening. Every snap of twig became a question, every movement in the brush a potential terror. One friend touched the water, and the ripple expanded like a shockwave, faces materializing, mouths opening in silent screams, eyes wide with frozen horror. The reflection stared back as though knowing them, recognizing them, and the friends flinched collectively, instinctively backing away, yet the creek's surface continued to shimmer and writhe. The harmonics of the choir pulsed in synchronization with the terror coursing through their veins, rising in pitch as the panic escalated, almost mocking the futility of human control. Time itself seemed to fracture. Minutes elongated into stretches of agony, each heartbeat syncing with the distorted harmonies. Directions became meaningless. Every step led them deeper into confusion. Devices failed, compasses betrayed them, and every instinct felt unreliable. The night pressed in, thick with unseen observation, and the friends began to question their own senses. Could their own minds be betraying them? Were they imagining the faces, the reflections, the distortions, or had the creek, the forest, the very air conspired to warp reality around them? Whispers threaded through the melody now, faint at first, then growing slightly more articulate, teasing at the edges of comprehension, hinting at names, at actions, at moments they had thought private. The harmony was no longer just sound, it had become a presence, a probing intelligence entwined with the night, aware of them in ways that chilled deeper than anything visible. A subtle dread settled into their limbs, numbing the edges of thought. Movement, even breathing, became deliberate and calculated, each action measured against the unseen anticipation of the music. They tried to communicate, to plan, but words tangled in panic, and even gestures seemed anticipated, reflected in the ever-shifting song. One friend reached again for the water, compelled, and the ripples expanded, distorting reflections into grotesque shapes that almost spoke, almost screamed, yet vanished before comprehension could form. Fear, fascination, and disorientation fused, leaving them paralyzed in a forest that had become unrecognizable, a night that had become sentient. The melody grew louder, circling, anticipating, matching the cadence of terror itself, and the friends realized the world around them had changed, bending to the song, twisting their perceptions into shapes too unnatural to endure for long. The night pressed on, unrelenting. The faces in the creek shimmered, harmonies warped, compasses spun, and the friends stumbled blindly in the shadows, caught between the lure of curiosity and the crushing weight of panic. Every rational thought faltered under the pressure of the impossible, and the forest, the water, and the haunting choir fused into a single entity, alive and aware, threading fear into their bones. There was no escape yet, no conclusion, only the relentless presence of sound, shadow, and reflection, an orchestration of terror that refused to release them. The night pressed closer, wrapping the friends in an oppressive stillness, yet the choir had grown impossibly louder, each note attuned to their every heartbeat, every breath. The rhythm of the song seemed to sense when fear gripped their chests, rising and falling in perfect, cruel synchronization with their pulses. They shouted, desperate to break the pattern, waving arms, stamping feet, But the music anticipated each reaction, echoing it back, twisted and warped, multiplying their terror. Each inhale they drew, each frantic step they took, the choir mirrored, a predatory awareness threading through the forest, the creek, and even the air between them. The world itself had begun to bend. Trees leaned in unnatural ways, shadows stretched and recoiled, and every reflection on the water's surface shimmered with shapes that were almost human, almost alive. But impossible. Panic became a tangible weight pressing into their shoulders, making limbs heavy, thoughts jagged. The creek seemed to pulse in time with the song, water rippling without wind, sending tremors across the shore that mirrored the rapid drum of their hearts. Faces surfaced in the moving reflections, mouths opening and closing in silent screams that matched the melody's tone. One friend tried to run, but the forest had transformed into a labyrinth. Paths twisted, familiar markers now distorted, trees appearing where there had been none. Every direction became uncertain. Every movement seemed predicted. The music was no longer just a sound. It was an extension of the night itself. A sentient force pressing against their senses, bending perception, twisting space and time. They stumbled, colliding with roots and rocks, and yet the choir anticipated their impact, swelling and dipping in perfect, grotesque rhythm with their struggle. Voices whispered in unison with the melody, repeating fragments of their thoughts and fears, hinting at memories they had never voiced aloud. The friends glanced at each other, eyes wide with uncomprehending horror, yet none could speak. The words caught in throats choked with fear. The music pulsed stronger, and their own hearts felt no longer their own, but instruments in the choir's omniscient symphony vibrating with a presence that had absorbed them into its rhythm. The creek, once a gentle and familiar backdrop, now felt malevolent, alive with a consciousness that observed, anticipated, and reflected their terror. Each ripple across its surface seemed measured, almost playful, forming ephemeral faces, mouths silently chanting in harmony with the voices surrounding them. They tried to coordinate, to flee together, but the song anticipated every instinctive move. Footsteps faltered. Panic spread in waves, each friend instinctively moving opposite directions, yet every choice the choir mirrored, turning hope into disorientation. The melody wrapped around the trees, threading through the branches and leaves, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. Their bodies responded with terror before their minds could catch up. Muscles tensing, hearts hammering, breaths ragged. Even attempts to shield themselves, covering ears, pressing against each other, felt ineffective. As the voices pulsed inside the skull as much as they rang across the clearing, time fractured. Seconds elongated into drawn-out moments, each matched by the choir's meticulous rhythm. The friends' understanding of reality splintered. Was the forest moving, or had they become unmoored within a dream that reflected their terror? The boundaries of self and environment blurred. Shapes in the creek flickered, shadowy and semi-corporeal, aligning with the song, rising and falling in tandem with every heartbeat. One friend reached for the water instinctively, and the ripples formed grotesque caricatures of their own faces, twisting, screaming silently, echoing the choir's warped harmonies. The creek song had become a living entity, an extension of the night itself, reacting with deliberate awareness to their fear and confusion. Each breath, each trembling step, each desperate glance back at the fire or toward the trees was absorbed into the choir's rhythm. It pulsed like a predator's heartbeat, omnipresent, omniscient, aligning with the innermost terror of the campers. The friends realized they were no longer observers. They were instruments, the melody threading through them, rewriting their perception, reshaping reality with every chord. The night became a single, unbroken note of dread, impossibly aware, impossibly patient, waiting for the collapse that inevitably followed. Their terror, once individual, became collective, a living pulse synchronized to the dissonant symphony of the creek, the trees, and the invisible choir that now had them fully in its grasp. Fear had finally shattered whatever fragile cohesion the friends had maintained, and the night erupted into chaos as each took off blindly into the forest, branches clawing at skin and clothing, roots tripping feet, mud-sucking shoes as if the earth itself sought to hold them in place. The choir followed relentlessly, omnipresent, omniscient, echoing from multiple directions at once, a suffocating symphony that seemed to stretch the forest into infinite darkness. Panic twisted their senses, each footstep uncertain, every glance over the shoulder revealing shadows that weren't quite shadows, forms that flickered at the edge of perception, shapes that rose and fell with the cursed melody. The music no longer merely anticipated them, it dictated the rhythm of the night, aligning with their accelerated hearts, their ragged breaths, their frantic movements, transforming the air into a vibrating, sentient presence that pressed in from all sides. Branches tore at faces, and thorns dug into arms, but the friends barely noticed. Their minds were consumed entirely by the music, each note a physical weight pressing down, each harmony a tether pulling them deeper into the forest, twisting the familiar paths into a maze that shifted with every panicked step. Shadows flickered across the ground, sometimes appearing as distorted faces, sometimes as long-limbed figures gliding silently between the trees, always just beyond reach, always synchronized with the pulsing rhythm of the choir. They stumbled over rocks, over fallen logs, over each other, yet the melody anticipated every falter, rising and falling in a mockery of their terror, turning moments of instinctive survival into a nightmarish dance choreographed by some unseen hand dot. The creek's voice followed them too, its waters reflecting ghostly patterns that mirrored their panic, ripples forming screaming faces for the fraction of a second before vanishing as though mocking their attempts to orient themselves. Every attempt to regroup ended in disorientation. Each friend's path seemed separate, yet the choir's omniscient presence wove their movements together into a single, horrifying symphony of fear. Their own footsteps betrayed them, echoing off unseen hollows, magnified and distorted, becoming part of the music that pursued them, leaving no silence, no reprieve, no sanctuary. The trees themselves seemed alive, bending in impossible ways, their trunks swaying to the choir's rhythm, branches entwining to form barriers, guiding them down corridors that led nowhere. The forest had become both stage and instrument, a living extension of the song, shaping and reshaping reality around them. Screams erupted and collided, overlapping with the choir in dissonance yet somehow harmonizing, each cry absorbed into the melody as if the night hungered for it. Fear became physical, a tangible force tightening around chests, knotting stomachs, making limbs heavy and thoughts jagged. No sense of time remained. Moments stretched and fractured, each heartbeat a drum in the endless symphony of terror. Shadows coalesced at the periphery of vision, fleeting forms that might have been friends, might have been figments, always aligning with the pulsing rhythm, always retreating when confronted, only to reappear in another place, keeping the group apart, ensuring isolation within the collective panic dot. Branches tore away skin, mud clung to shoes, and lungs burned, yet none could stop, none could pause. Every movement was anticipated, every choice mirrored, twisted, and returned in haunting harmony. The forest had become infinite, the music omnipresent, and the friends' terror a single pulse coursing through it. Even as exhaustion gnawed at them, a perverse energy seemed to rise in response, forcing them onward, deeper, until the line between fleeing and being pursued dissolved entirely. The night itself was alive, a malevolent conductor orchestrating their despair, ensuring that no one would move freely, that the choir's omnipotent presence would dominate every shadow, every reflection, every footstep, until the forest had claimed not just their voices, but their very perception of reality. By the time the chaos consumed each friend individually, their shapes swallowed by darkness, the creek's melody lingered, echoing faintly in the spaces between trees, in the sway of branches, in the ghostly reflection of moonlight on water. The forest remembered their panic, the song retained their fear, and the night kept its vigil, patient and unyielding, waiting for the next careless listener brave enough, or foolish enough, to wander too close, to hear the choir and to follow it into the woods where the night's harmony devoured all sense of self. When the lone survivor emerged from the woods days later, he seemed less a person than a shadow stitched together from exhaustion, panic, and memory fraying at the edges. His eyes darted constantly, never settling, scanning for shapes that were not there, and his footsteps crunched softly over the leaf-strewn ground as though afraid even the forest itself might remember him. The creek lay calm, a mirror of placid normalcy, yet beneath its reflective surface, subtle distortions hinted at the horrors it had witnessed. Small ripples formed patterns that seemed deliberate, faces emerging for a heartbeat before vanishing into the water as though mocking the world's insistence on ordinary perception. Leaves scattered along the shore were faintly scorched, curling at the edges, carrying the scent of smoke that hadn't come from any fire the survivor, or anyone else, had started. Each detail pressed on him with quiet insistence, a reminder that the night's events were neither random nor fleeting, and that the creek itself had become a repository for the terror he had endured. He traced his steps from the campsite to the edge of the forest, noting footprints that did not match his own, the patterns faintly suggesting the forms of those he had lost, or that the forest had claimed. Panic still lingered under his skin, a dull, constant ache that tightened with every sound. The whisper of wind through the trees, the distant chirp of an owl, the gentle lap of water against the stones. In each sound, he thought he could hear echoes of the choir, harmonizing impossibly with his heartbeat, teasing him with reminders of its presence even in the light of day. The forest around him seemed to exhale and inhale with him, carrying faint traces of movement, of unseen watchers, and of the melody that had driven his friends apart. He moved slowly, methodically, as though aware that any sudden action might awaken what lingered in the shadows, but he could feel it anyway. The memory of voices etched into the creek, into the woods, into the very air around him, a residue of fear that refused to fade. When he reached the clearing, the fire pit was cold and scattered with ashes that hadn't existed when they had fled, the embers shaped into faint arcs, curves and crescents that seemed deliberate. The arrangements formed shapes that could have been a face, or many faces layered atop one another, glaring up at him from the ground, mocking his survival and marking the forest as a domain beyond human comprehension. The creek itself shimmered unnaturally in the afternoon sun, each wave reflecting the twisted contours of the faces he had glimpsed in darkness, and as he leaned closer, the surface shimmered with movement that was not water, something alive beneath the mirrored calm. Even the air carried faint remnants of the night's melody, a ghostly undertone vibrating through his bones, tugging at his memory, reminding him that what had been witnessed could not be left behind. He wandered through the campsite, noting that every tent, every log, every stone seemed subtly altered, shifted just enough to suggest the presence of forces that moved when unobserved, forces that had learned from the panic and now lingered, patient and eternal. He tried to speak, tried to call for help, but his voice faltered, swallowed by the creek's quiet hum, a distant chorus that seemed to answer only in repetition of his own thoughts. Footsteps in the underbrush, none matching his own, reminded him of the friends lost, and though he could see no one, he could feel them, or what had taken them, woven into the ambient sound of the woods. Each passing moment reinforced the understanding that the creek did not forget, that the music of the night had inscribed itself permanently into this place, leaving behind a record of every heartbeat, every scream, and every shattered mind that had dared to listen. By the time he emerged from the trees entirely, he understood that survival had not meant escape. The memory of that night, the harmonies, the faces, and the patterns in the water would accompany him forever, a quiet terror lying just beneath awareness, ready to resurface with the slightest lapse in attention. He left the creek behind, but its song remained, faint and persistent, etched into the air and into his mind, carrying the voices of those who had not survived, and the reminder that the forest, the creek, and the night itself retained a memory far older and more patient than any human presence. And as he walked toward the distant road, he whispered to no one, warning himself more than anyone else. The creek remembers, and it keeps what it hears, waiting for the next visitor foolish enough to linger, foolish enough to listen too long. Even after leaving the forest behind, the survivor could not escape the memory of Hollow Creek. Each step along the winding trail seemed heavier than the last, as though the ground itself remembered the night and weighed him down with it. The air felt thicker, charged with a presence he could neither see nor touch, a faint vibration running through the soles of his boots and up his spine. Every rustle of leaves, every distant snap of a branch, mirrored the rhythm of the choir, aligning with his heartbeat, reminding him that the creek's voices had followed him beyond its banks. In the towns he passed, nothing appeared out of place. The world went on, mundane and indifferent. Yet, in the quiet moments, the blink of an eye, the pause between breaths, he could hear it. Faint harmonies drifting on the wind, just on the edge of comprehension, circling him in patterns he had no way to track. At night, sleep became impossible. Even under the safety of walls and roofs, he felt eyes tracing him, senses attuned to shadows that moved too subtly to name. The memory of faces forming in the water came unbidden over and over, their silent screams pressing at his mind, twisting his thoughts. He could feel the creek's song in every reflection, the mirror in the bathroom, the glass of a window, the shimmer of water in a puddle along the road. Each glimpse became a trap, a reminder that the world outside the forest was merely another layer in the same pattern, and that listening had been the first step in being claimed by it. The melody lingered not just in the air but inside him, a private torment no one else could hear, a pulse that kept pace with his own, a constant whisper of the friends he had lost and the ones who would never return. He tried to tell the story, to warn anyone who would listen, but words failed him. Conversations faltered. Disbelief made others step back, and he realized that the horror of Hollow Creek was not meant to be communicated. It was only to be survived, remembered, and endured. Even when he left the region entirely, taking roads and paths far from that forested hollow, the echoes followed. Sounds once ordinary, a babble of water from a sink, the wind through a ventilation grate, distant traffic, folded into the pattern, each carrying fragments of the choir, just below perception, just enough to remind him that nothing truly ends. The experience had been recorded inside him, an indelible trace of terror that would awaken with the slightest provocation. Months passed, yet the sensation of being watched never faded. He found himself retracing the route of their flight, unconsciously moving along the creek's edge in dreams, hearing the harmonies rise in perfect, impossible layers, matching the beat of his chest. The memory of his friends, the faces, the water, and the music was so vivid that waking life often felt like another layer of the same nightmare. He learned to avoid reflections, to ignore the call of small creeks and streams, but it was futile. Hollow Creek had marked him, and the world had become an extension of its memory. Even silence had a texture now, a weight that pressed against him with the same rhythm, echoing the ghostly harmonies that had driven the group into the woods. By the time he realized the depth of the effect, he was alone in every sense. The creek had claimed its audience, and he remained as a vessel, carrying the chorus, replaying it in quiet moments, in breaths, in heartbeats. He understood that survival was not an escape, but a continuation of the same experience, a slow, unyielding communion with a place that had absorbed the fear, the panic, and the terror, transforming it into something living, something patient, something that remembered everyone who had ever listened too long. And in that understanding, he knew the truth of Hollow Creek, that the voices would never leave, that they existed now in him as much as in the water, in the wind, and in every shadow, an echo that never faded, a choir that would carry on for as long as he drew breath. The highway stretched on, a ribbon of asphalt vanishing into the night, headlights cutting through the darkness like fragile blades. Somewhere ahead, a reflection caught his eye, an exit sign, long forgotten, its paint peeling and dim reflectors flickering under the beam of his cab lights. It seemed out of place, almost impossible to spot in the monotony of blackened trees and empty road, yet there it was, beckoning. He eased onto the exit, expecting the quiet reprieve of a rest stop, a simple detour to stretch legs and grab a coffee, but the air immediately felt heavier, denser, as if the forest itself had leaned in closer to watch. The hum of the truck's engine and the tires against asphalt seemed swallowed by the night, leaving a strange, pressing stillness that gnawed at the edges of his senses. As he drove further along the exit, the faint glow of his headlights revealed the emptiness. No parked cars, no convenience stores, not even the faint flicker of neon lights. The trees clustered closer to the road than they should have, casting long, gnarled shadows that writhed across the asphalt, twisting into shapes that defied the geometry of branches and trunks. Every familiar sound, every expected night noise, crickets, distant traffic, the rustle of leaves, was absent. Only the distant whistle of wind moved through the pines, sharp and cold, carrying the faint metallic smell of damp earth and pine resin. It was the kind of quiet that isn't neutral. It has a weight, a subtle pressure that bends the mind toward unease. He tried to dismiss it, blaming fatigue, the monotony of hours behind the wheel, the isolation of a lone trucker on a late-night route. But even as he rationalized, his eyes caught movement just beyond the trees, shadows that seemed to stretch toward him and flickers of light that vanished when he blinked or shifted his gaze. The road beneath his tires was smooth, yet the air carried a sense of waiting, as though the asphalt and the surrounding forest were holding their breath, observing his every turn. Even the familiar scent of diesel and asphalt was tinged with something colder, something that hinted at more than mere weather or nightfall. He slowed the truck, scanning the exit for any sign of life, any landmark that suggested normalcy. The peeling sign swayed slightly in the wind, though no breeze touched his face. The dim reflectors glimmered just enough to catch attention, yet offered no guidance. The trees pressed closer on either side, their shadows intersecting in strange, unnatural angles, making the road feel narrower than it should, the cab feel smaller than it ever had. Every instinct told him to keep moving, but curiosity and the faint hope of a simple rest stop kept him following the exit, deeper into the silence. With each passing second, the stillness became more oppressive. It was no longer just quiet. It was heavy, a weight that seemed to press down on his shoulders, on the cab itself, urging him to notice the oddities he had been ignoring. The way the road curved in subtle, unnatural loops, the way distant trees appeared closer than possible, the flicker of light at the edge of the tree line that never quite stayed put. The forest was no longer a backdrop. It was alive with intent, patient and deliberate, and he felt, with a growing sense of dread, that he was no longer simply driving through it. He was being watched, measured, and guided, though by what or whom he could not yet know. Even as the familiar hum of the truck's engine continued beneath him, the exit ahead offered no reassurance. It promised nothing except the slow, creeping realization that the night, the road, and the trees were no longer the ordinary companions of a routine journey. Something had begun its subtle work, and he was already too deep to turn back. He followed the fated exit deeper into the night, expecting the familiar stretch of asphalt to curve toward some long-abandoned rest stop, a small patch of civilization amid the darkened forest. But the road did not curve as it should have. It simply ended. One moment the tires rolled over smooth blacktop. The next, the asphalt gave way to an uneven, shadowed forest floor. The headlights stretched outward, illuminating nothing but dense trees, their trunks unnaturally long and narrow, their branches swaying in ways that seemed deliberate, almost sentient. He slammed on the brakes, the screech echoing through the stillness like a gunshot, but there was no shoulder, no escape. Only the forest, endless and pressing, stretched out around him. His pulse quickened as he tried to turn the truck, to reverse back toward the highway, only to discover that the exit had seemingly vanished behind him. The road he had just driven now melted into the same unbroken forest, the asphalt smooth, unbroken, as if the detour had never existed at all. A chill crawled along his spine as he realized he was alone in a place that defied the rules of distance and direction. He fumbled with the radio, hoping for a familiar voice, a station that would tether him to the world beyond these trees. Static hissed through the speakers, a faint, whispering undertone that he initially ignored as interference. But then the static sharpened, coalescing into phrases he could almost understand. Snippets of his cargo manifest, numbers, abbreviations, and destinations emerged from the white noise, repeated over and over. The words were precise, almost mocking, and each repetition seemed to echo from somewhere behind him, though the forest around him remained silent. He twisted in his seat, scanning the shadows that stretched unnaturally at the edges of the headlights. Every tree trunk seemed to bend toward him, every shadow flickering with impossible angles. With each movement of the truck, the road ahead shifted as though it were alive. Every attempt to backtrack, to regain the exit, only led him deeper into the darkness. The truck's lights elongated the trees, warping distances, making the familiar forest contours impossible to judge. Branches that should have swayed gently now leaned and twisted toward him, scraping against the sides of the cab with dry, whispering taps that matched the static's rhythm. He reached for the door handle, tempted to abandon the vehicle and flee into the forest, but the ground outside was uneven, broken by tangled roots and unseen dips, each step seeming to push him backward into the cab, away from escape. The sense of violation grew, not of anyone touching him physically, but of the forest itself rearranging itself, moving the road, the exit, even the air around him, into patterns meant to confuse, to trap. The whispers in the radio became clearer, more precise, and with each phrase, his sense of reality frayed. The words of his cargo manifest had no right to reach him here, yet they did, as though some unseen observer knew not just what he carried, but the intentions he had yet to make, the thoughts he had yet to think. Shadows at the periphery of the headlights danced independently, sometimes ahead of the truck, sometimes behind, as if teasing him with the glimpses of a path that was never meant to exist. The faint rustle of leaves, the snap of twigs beneath invisible feet, made the hair on his arms prickle. He tried to call out, but his voice sounded swallowed, hollow, bouncing uselessly into the darkness. The road was no longer an inert surface beneath his wheels. It had become a living entity, responsive and deliberate. A corridor designed not for travel, but for observation and entrapment. Time itself seemed to distort. The seconds dragged yet raced past, the moonlight flickering inconsistently through the dense canopy. Every glance at the cab instruments revealed impossible readings, distances that grew even as he drove, speedometers oscillating wildly, compass needles spinning like they had lost faith in true north. And all the while, the static whispers continued, trailing and echoing his movements, sometimes from the left, sometimes from the right, always just outside his peripheral vision. He realized with a creeping panic that the exit he had taken, the detour he had followed, may never have existed. Or, if it had been consumed by something far larger than himself, something patient, intelligent, and aware. Each heartbeat became a drum of urgency, each breath a reminder of his isolation. The forest was no longer just a backdrop. It was an active participant, bending physics, warping perception, and amplifying fear. He could feel the asphalt ending behind him, disappearing and reappearing, a cruel joke played by something unseen. The truck was trapped in a loop, a corridor of impossibility, the whispers growing louder, carrying fragments of knowledge meant only for him. And yet, the more he tried to escape, the more the road shifted beneath him, deeper into shadows that promised no return. The whispers over the radio had grown sharper now, cutting through the night like a serrated edge. At first, he had dismissed them as static, a trick of old equipment, but now they were precise, almost articulate, repeating the exact details of his cargo with a rhythm that made his skin crawl. Pallets, manifests, serial numbers. Every element of his shipment he had not spoken aloud was being called out as though some unseen presence had memorized it, dissected it, and was taunting him with its knowledge. He twisted in his seat, scanning the tree line through the headlights, expecting some shadowed figure or reflection, but there was nothing, only the forest, dense and silent, stretching endlessly into the black. Every attempt to turn the truck around only made the road ahead twist into shapes that defied geometry, bends where there should have been straightaways, dips and rises that appeared out of nowhere, leaving him disoriented and increasingly certain that the exit had never been real. The shadows at the edges of the headlights had begun moving independently, no longer tethered to any object. A tree would stretch unnaturally to the left, only to snap back into place moments later, its shadow lingering where it shouldn't, forming angles that made his eyes ache. Branches scraped against the cab in irregular rhythms, matching the static's cadence, as though the forest itself had learned to speak in whispers. He reached instinctively for the radio, trying to change channels, mute the signal, anything to break the pattern, but every button pressed only seemed to emphasize the whispers, which now carried a faint echo, doubling the effect, layering the voices over themselves until it became impossible to determine which direction they came from. Each repetition of his cargo manifest was a personal affront, a reminder that he was being observed, catalogued, and toyed with. With every mile, or what he thought was a mile, the road warped further. The asphalt stretched into impossible distances, curving into the trees in ways that should have been physically impossible. Each attempt to reverse was met with immediate failure. The moment he steered toward what should have been the main highway, the exit reappeared like a cruel mirage, a strip of road he could never reach without twisting back into the same unbroken forest. The truck shivered under his hands as though sensing his desperation, tires spinning over terrain that should not exist, yet somehow did. blending asphalt and dirt, shadow and light, into one continuous, unnavigable corridor. He realized with rising dread that the forest and the road were working together, the path itself alive, anticipating his every maneuver, responding with delays and loops, warping reality into a pattern designed to trap him indefinitely. His eyes darted constantly between the dashboard and the road, searching for signs of normality, any hint that he could reestablish a connection with reality. The odometer fluctuated wildly, counting distances that he had not traveled, while the speedometer jumped erratically, as if the truck existed partially outside the laws of physics. And still the whispers persisted, now interspersed with subtle, almost imperceptible additions. Fragments of conversation he had with himself earlier that day, the route planning he had performed in his head, even thoughts about delivery schedules and fuel stops. The radio, the forest, the road, they were no longer separate entities. They had merged into a singular, attentive presence, and he was under scrutiny. The shadows at the edge of his vision began forming patterns he recognized, shapes that mimicked the exact outline of the cargo stacked in the truck bed, elongated and distorted, as though projected onto the trees themselves. The whispers became faster, overlapping, repeating, layering, a relentless tide that pushed against his sanity. Each echo of his load was an accusation, a reminder that he was being observed, catalogued, perhaps even judged. The road refused to yield, the exit remained a phantom, and the radio's distorted intelligence grew more intimate, more invasive, each detail a personal affront. He gripped the steering wheel tighter, knuckles white, and forced himself to keep moving, aware that stopping might mean surrendering to whatever force had claimed the highway. Every glance into the mirrors revealed nothing but dark trees and impossible angles. Yet he could feel the weight of unseen eyes tracking him, predicting every movement. The road had become a labyrinth, and the whispers. A map written in terror, guiding him deeper into the forest's unknowable maw. And still, no solution appeared, only the hum of static, the bending asphalt, and the relentless, chilling repetition of what he carried, the load, his cargo, the evidence of his presence in a world that had no intention of letting him leave. Every attempt to escape led him deeper into the dense forest, as if the trees themselves had rearranged to block every exit. Familiar landmarks vanished, replaced by twisted shapes that seemed to stretch impossibly into the night. Headlights bounced off trunks that loomed closer than they should, casting shadows that moved independently, slithering across the asphalt in patterns that made no sense. The truck's instruments flickered erratically, speedometer needle swinging wildly, odometer counting miles that he could not have traveled, and the GPS spun in confused circles, offering routes that were impossible, exits that disappeared the moment he approached them. Each time he tried to retrace his path, the forest shifted, corridors of shadow and light bending unnaturally, forcing him further into the unknown dot. The radio whispers persisted, sometimes behind him, sometimes ahead, as though the road itself had gained awareness, and every word was personal, echoing the cargo manifest and fragments of his own internal thoughts. He tried to reason it out, blaming fatigue, storm-induced disorientation, or a malfunctioning radio, but nothing explained the eerie precision of the whispers, or the way the forest seemed to anticipate his every movement. Branches scraped the cab, leaves swirled in unnatural eddies, and distant twigs snapped in patterns too deliberate to be random. The air was thick with the smell of wet earth and something metallic, like a warning or a premonition, pressing against him in the enclosed space of the cab. He twisted the wheel to retrace his path, only to find the road folding back upon itself, looping in ways that made it impossible to measure distance. Every turn seemed to land him in the same stretch of asphalt, the same looming trunks, the same twisting shadows. The forest was no longer a background. It had become an active presence, a living, calculating entity that watched, judged, and toyed with him. Even the darkness felt deliberate, thickening in certain corners, parting in others, creating pockets of uncertainty where his headlights revealed glimpses of impossible forms. Sometimes he thought he saw figures standing just beyond the tree line, but when he blinked or adjusted his view, they were gone, leaving only the rustling of leaves and the low, static-laced murmurs from the radio dot. The truck's interior felt smaller, oppressive, as if the cabin itself was shrinking to contain him, amplifying the sound of his own breathing and the incessant whispers. He checked the mirrors obsessively, half expecting to see something behind him, but only the same looping forest appeared, each reflection a distorted echo of the world outside. Objects in the cab rattled without explanation, the coffee cup sliding slightly, papers fluttering as though pushed by unseen hands. His mind began to fray at the edges, each impossible reading, each shifting shadow, each whispering fragment of his load gnawing at his grip on reality. Time had lost meaning. The minutes, or hours, passed in strange rhythms, and the road's geometry defied any memory of linear space. Every effort to flee reinforced the forest's dominance. Every glance into the mirrors or over the hood reminded him of the forest's attentiveness. He began to doubt the exit had ever existed, if it had ever been real, or if the highway itself was designed to consume those who ventured too far alone, feeding on isolation and fear. The whispers grew louder, overlapping, repeating, almost anticipating his thoughts before he had even formed them. The line between reality and hallucination blurred, leaving only the oppressive sense that the forest, the road, and the radio were one, and he was the intruder. Dawn broke with a muted light, pale and cold, spilling over a highway that now seemed perfectly ordinary. The trucker eased onto the asphalt, scanning for the exit that had swallowed him whole the night before. But there was nothing. No peeling sign, no faded reflector, no trace of the forested detour. The trees ended at the shoulder. The horizon stretched wide and uninterrupted, as if the road had never diverged. The cab felt impossibly still, the storm of whispers and shadowed corridors fading to a faint hum beneath the hum of the engine. Yet the air carried a residual weight, a tension that suggested the events of the night had left their mark somewhere he could not see. He reached instinctively for the radio, and it responded with nothing but static, soft and crackling. Yet, for a heartbeat, it seemed to echo fragments of his cargo manifest, the words repeating in slow, measured pulses. He tried to recall the twists and turns, the loops that had trapped him in a forest that defied geometry, but his memory wavered, each recollection feeling both vivid and impossibly distant. The road beneath him looked unbroken, familiar, mundane, yet the lingering uncertainty gnawed at him. Had it been a hallucination born of isolation, a fatigue-induced dream? Or had the highway itself been a predator, feeding on solitude and fear, testing him before letting him go? Every object in the cab seemed ordinary, yet subtle cues reminded him of what had occurred. The coffee cup sat still, papers flat, instruments functioning normally, but the gnawing awareness remained that he had been somewhere else entirely, somewhere that obeyed rules foreign to the waking world. The memory of the shadows that moved independently, of the whispers that anticipated his thoughts, of the road bending impossibly back on itself, pressed against the edges of his mind. Each recalled moment felt like a warning, a lesson etched into his consciousness that the highway could not be fully trusted. He drove on, the sun rising higher, illuminating the roadside diners, empty lots, and distant signs of civilization. Normalcy appeared to return, yet he glanced at the shoulder repeatedly, half expecting the forest to re-emerge, half expecting another exit to yawn open where none should exist. The highway stretched ahead, straight and endless, but every mile carried a residue of the night before, a sense that some roads exist only to ensnare, and that some travelers are marked, even when they escape. The whispering had ceased, yet the echoes lingered in his mind, unrelenting, reminding him of every detail he had thought private. Even as other vehicles passed, trucks and cars bound for mundane destinations, he felt apart, isolated, carrying with him a knowledge that could not be shared. The exit had vanished, the forest had receded, and the radio had returned to its silence. But the memory of the road that folded in on itself, the shadows that defied logic, and the whispers of his cargo would remain. Every time he closed his eyes, he could still see the elongated trees, the impossible loops, and the road feeding on his solitude. The trucker understood that the highway had let him go, but only because it chose to, and that some corners of the world remained untouched by explanation, waiting silently for the next traveler foolish enough to take a fated exit. By mid-morning, he arrived at the next junction, the sun warm on his shoulders, the asphalt familiar, continuous. The detour was gone, as though it had never existed. Yet he could not shake the certainty that the events had been real, and that somewhere, just beyond the edge of perception, the forest and the road waited, patient and deliberate, for the next traveler to stumble into the impossible. Even in daylight, the echo of that night lingered, a reminder that some roads are not meant to be fully understood, and that silence can be far more terrifying than the shadows themselves.